Welcome to Literary Dialogs with Nina Serrano, bringing you wonderful poets and writers who read from their original works supporting peace, justice, and a healthy planet. I'm your host, Nina Serrano. Today's guest is Valerie Haynes Perry, author and writing coach and my good friend. Today, I've invited her to interview me. I will be the guest and she will be the host. Welcome, Valerie.
Nina, thank you so much for saying yes when we discussed the possibility of having this conversation today. Now, Nina, you're an author of poetry, nonfiction, scripts, a novel, and more. Recently, we both attended a professional meeting in which one of the other participants found out that you're a poet and asked you whether the experience of writing poetry is different from writing a novel, or she was wondering if you could contrast the two experiences.
Writing a novel for me was an endless task. It took me 26 years to finish that novel, for example, and writing a poem can just be a matter of minutes, though that's not usual because I usually rewrite everything. And I find that there's a story that I wanted to tell in terms of writing a novel, but in writing a poem, it's more a feeling or an event that I want to explore in a poem, and I know that I'm going to do it relatively quickly. That is, it'll be 1, 2, 3 pages at most, certainly not 500 pages. So there's a different time sense in writing the two. And also in writing a novel, I have pretty much an idea of what the story is about. Well, of course, I've only written one and it was historic, so I had to kind of follow the contours of history. But in writing a poem, I'm always or very often surprised by what the poem is about. I think I'm starting to write about one thing, but by the time I'm ready for the last line of the poem, sometimes a whole other thing is revealed to me, what I really felt about it in those usually the last 2 lines.
In the process of revising a poem, you take into consideration where it ends up. You mentioned that initially you might think it's one thing, it turns into something else, and then you kind of deal with that. Do you trust that process for the most part?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Okay.
I trust it. It didn't ever occur to me that I could distrust it.
Okay. The reason I'm asking that question is now I'm reminded of another conversation we had recently in which we were talking about writing freely, whatever that might mean to any particular poet, versus feeling somewhat driven to conform to structure. Do you have to consciously resolve your intuition or trusting where the writing takes you with any kind of limitations?
Well, there are absolutely no formal restrictions as I'm writing, mostly because I don't know enough about poetry. I don't have an MFA in poetry, for example. So I don't know enough about forms, and I've explored very few forms myself, so that I don't have that thought about stepping on any rules of poetry, on the toes of the rules of poetry. But I do have very strong ideological guidelines, so that if a poem maybe fell into any sexist or racist or imperialist ideological waters that I don't approve of, I would kind of pull away, drift away from that. That would be the only things that get in my way. Also, I tend not to use bad language, that is language forbidden by the FCC, because I read my poems on radio. And that is one of the no-nos, is none of the 7 forbidden words. But also, since I don't really like those words or use them in my daily speech, that's not much of a problem.
Nina, your poetry has such tremendous presence. It feels as if you could write poems continuously about everything. Can you talk a little bit about your personal process in deciding to write a poem?
Yes, there's been a poem that I've been wanting to write since Christmas Day, and now we must be at least a week away from Christmas Day. And I haven't written it yet, but I think about it. I think about it before I go to bed, and I close my eyes and I try to go to sleep, and I start writing this poem. And it's for this poem in particular, it's about going outside to see the star, the so-called Christmas star, when the 2 planets were coming close together. And I try to find language to describe what happens as I go out the door. And there in the street light, I catch a glimpse of my neighbor, and her hair is all loose and caught in the street light, and she's with her little white dog that has curly white hair. And I call out to her, and she's startled and turned around, and we start talking. And of course, I'm so starved for live conversation. And I'm married, so I live with my husband, Paul Richards, a wonderful man, but I'm particularly starved for female company. So I'm so thrilled when I see her, and she comes over to the bottom of my staircase and we start chatting. And then I also do look up at the star. And it was so wonderful to talk to her and how I felt. And when I came inside, how my body felt different because I'd had human contact and contact with another woman. But I haven't been able to write. It isn't that I'm not able to write it. I haven't started to write it. Usually I was told by my good friend who's long since gone, Mary Rudge, who was the poet laureate of Alameda County. She said, when you have the thought to write a poem, turn on the light, wake yourself up and write it down. And so I often do that. But with this poem, I just haven't gotten around to actually trying to commit to write it down. Because I don't know. I know that when I get to the end of the poem, I will find out what that encounter meant.
Thank you for giving us such an intimate look into your process as a poet, Nina. And now I'd like to make that special request of you to read.
I'll start with bells.
Thank you.
As a child, I used to tell time by the bells ringing from the church 3 blocks away. Hurry, get to school, they rang in the early morning. But in the tumult of everyone in the apartment getting ready for work and school, I didn't hear them. I really only listened for them when I stayed home from school by falsely insisting that I didn't feel well. My parents were at work. The house was quiet and lonely. At 3 o'clock when school let out, I heard the vibrating song, and again with a variation at 3:15. Now I was totally free to stop pretending to be sick. I could prepare for wellness and my parents' return with the hope of hugs and dinner, and to listen for the chiming, chiming, chiming of the evening bells.
As a listener, there's this pristine sense of innocence that I sense in the poem. I wonder if there are any other adjectives that you might apply to the poem, if innocence is one of them.
I don't think innocence is one of them. I'm surprised you've come up with innocence because it's about duplicity. It's about lying, but maybe childhood lying is innocent. The thing about writing poetry, I think, is about feeling, expressing, exploring my own, for me, it's exploring my own feelings and hoping to evoke feeling in the listener.
Well, you have definitely done that. And I just find this conversation so fascinating because what a perfect example of your intentions, if you will, or certainly what I asked you how you felt about your poem. You just said, well, it's about duplicity. I'm surprised you think it's about innocence. And it's just so beautiful that we can have clarity as the writers, the poets, other types of writers. And then those who listen bring all of these things into the writing that we just can't imagine. So I just am grateful I see innocence and now duplicity in Bells. Thank you, Nina. Would you please read Father's Day 2020 with love from your daughter next?
Yes, thank you. Father's Day 2020 with love from your daughter. Hey, Joe, what do you know? You were proud to be Joe, like Joe Blow, just a regular guy who fits right in, not a shy immigrant from Colombia whose family called him Hugo, who had only an eighth grade education because he had to work to support his widowed mother and little sister. Shoeshine boy, newsboy, bellboy, who drew cartoons and let other kids read them for a penny, because in those days, pennies could buy milk and bread. Hey, Joe, what do you know? You were thinking about metaphysics, cosmology, the meaning of life, the nature of God, drawing the humors of everyday living into cartoons. You sketched for decades in black ink. As a freelancer, 22 weekly roughs, a batch, waiting for the mailman daily to find their magazine rejection slips or acceptances. Born over 100 years ago, you followed your son into the celebratory 1960s, shedding the Cold War's conformity that you picked up in the 1950s. Then you planted yourself in the Yankee stronghold, where descendants of the Mayflower prevailed, and you felt lonely. Yet you thought up funny situations all day and drew them, struggling to make ends meet till the last day of your being. Hey, Joe, what do you know?
Beautiful, Nina. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
One thing I'd like to ask you about this poem, it feels so personal when you were writing it and also reading it. Was there a sense of interactivity with Joe, your father?
Well, I think that reoccurring line, hey, Joe, what do you know? That brings me into his world. That was a popular saying in the early 40s when I was first getting to know him. I think that hey, Joe, what do you know? Captured everything because it was trying to feel so vernacular, so American with the language. And the language of the 40s was very much like that, or at least that's how I remembered. And I know that my dad liked popular catchphrases like that.
Well, what a beautiful, I'll say, tribute to your dad, Nina, and that you wrote it this year. Thank you for sharing Father's Day 2020 with love from your daughter. And now would you please share Low Tide River Trail Morning?
I'd be happy to. Low tide river trail morning. Low, low tide on the pond. Mud islands and narrow water channels. Wading water birds hunting. No jumping fish today. My eyes feast on the sights of the trail, hungry for new vistas after endless shelter in my house. Under a clump of shade, I searched the broad river with binoculars for the swan family. That's them, The graceful group of seven, now all white. Have the spring brown speckled babies turned white and big like the parents? Or is this some other group of swans? A gray, dusty-looking egret makes a breathtaking, swooping landing like the ones I used to watch on Oakland's Lake Merritt, evoking Susan, reminding me that I miss her, of watching them together. The egrets inhabiting this water are snowy white, white like the pelicans and swans. I lift and lower my mask when humans pass. The familiar natural landmarks go by faster this morning. The sun burns brightly as it rises. I sink with hot, tired pleasure, singing my song into the white car waiting in the parking lot.
Beautiful, Nina. One thing that really stands out to me is the way you personify color. In this particular poem, Low Tide River Trail Morning, the repetition of the color white, the egrets inhabiting this river are snowy white, and then the immediate repetition of that color, white like the pelicans and swans, and then at the end, into the white car waiting in the parking lot. And I wonder if you, and I'm remembering when you were telling us about the poem that you've intended to write since Christmas, and it's just taking its time, being delivered, maybe like the baby Jesus or something. It's just taking its time. And you talked about looking up at a white star and looking at this light and the dominance of the color white. And I wonder, can you say whether you have a particular relationship to color in your poetry? And is there anything you can say about your relationship to color as a poet, Nina?
In terms of color, I think color sometimes does come out in my poems. And in terms of these walks along the river trail, the Napa River Trail, the color white does stand out because it seems like it's unusual to see white birds. Or for me, it's unusual to see white birds. When I lived in Oakland, the egrets, there were some snowy egrets, but mostly they were those dappled gray, brown kind of egrets. And there were seagulls, and they were kind of gray and white. But being up here, it seems like along the Napa River, there's white birds, lots of them, and they stand out against the blue, blue water. And when the sky is really blue and the water's really blue, they stand out. And they're big birds, like the pelicans and the swans. They're major birds. And I was brought up in New York City, so really the only birds I ever saw, probably till I was about 18 or 19, till I was about 19, the only birds I ever saw outside of people's houses were pigeons and sparrows, gray birds. And inside the houses, I would see canaries and parrots. And of course, at the zoo, there were all kinds of birds. But yes, in this poem and in walking along the Napa River, white birds do stand out in my mind because they seem the big ones, big like the clouds.
What a beautiful expression, Nina. Thank you so much. And I want to focus on two lines. The line, "The familiar natural landmarks go by faster this morning." I just want to comment about what a beautiful sense of motion you interject with those two lines. The fact that these landmarks go by faster and how the words just stand on their own. I just loved how you added motion in such a gentle way. And the other thing I want to mention that is relevant to the next two poems that you're going to share with us is this poem part of your pandemic poetry collection?
Yes, I do consider it one of my pandemic poems. I have many more pandemic poems than what I recorded and called pandemic poems, because all the poems I'm writing now, more or less, are pandemic poems, and many of them make reference to it because I guess I'm writing to be included in our local newspaper, the Benicia Herald, where the poet laureate of Benicia, Mary Susan Gast, edits a column, Going the Distance, in which she chooses poems about the pandemic to put in it. So in a sense, I guess I'm writing to be chosen. And I have often been chosen, so I'm very excited about that. So that got me in the habit of acknowledging the pandemic in the poetry.
Now that we're in the pandemic poetry groove, could I ask you to please read Long Time No See, Poets in the Moment?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Long time no see, poets in the moment. Welcoming her, I cannot see her glorious smile under the mask. Her uncut hair hangs longer. We catch up. She'd written a new book of poems. Bravo! Gone through the pandemic roller coaster. Me too. We sit in the backyard shade, drinking in the moment, the right now of it, among hummingbirds, finches, and a swaying wind chime in the warm breeze. The moment relaxes and stretches to read each other our poems. Some uplift, some face the plague and climatic traumas. Then we write new poems in a complicated form, though we are both usually free versers, letting the poem take us where it may. Remembering how we used to sing in her car on the way to and from live poetry readings, we sing the old favorites. The finches sing too. Our duet has a choir, raising goosebumps on my arm. She leaves, promising to return. The songs hang in the air. In the early evening, I go to water the yard. The plants sing out, it's the hammer of justice. It's the bell of freedom. It's the love between my brothers and my sisters all over this land.
Thank you so much, Nina.
You're welcome.
Oh,
That poem's always a challenge. I never know if I'm going to be able to sing those last lines.
and you always do.
Yes, I do.
That was beautiful. I want to just make one comment. The lines are, the moment relaxes and stretches to read each other our poems. I just love that suspension of time, this moment that relaxes and stretches. It's just, there's this beautiful timelessness, and it's such a beautiful introduction to singing with the finches, or having that awareness of nature and just being a part of a whole. Next, the story of two Ninas.
This poem was written on my 85th birthday. That's over a year ago. The story of two Ninas. Two Ninas, a generation apart. The younger said to the older, I read in your biography that as a child you traveled in New York City on subways and buses alone. The older, in response, told the younger how between the ages of 10 and 12, she had seen so many penises because sometimes men on trains expose themselves, penis after penis. The younger said, me too. I traveled on subways and buses at those ages, and taking advantage of crowded conditions, men would rub against me. Neither of the Ninas had ever discussed this aloud. They had simply found clever, youthful ways to escape their pursuers, assuming that it was part of the price of freedom to travel. It took thousands of Me Too's decades later to mention it, because sexual harassment has been so commonplace, so unspeakably unnotable, that even now, decades later, when two accused molesters sit on the Supreme Court to pass judgment, determining what civil society allows, the two Ninas broke their silence. Their misadventures spilled out, trapped for decades, as the shared Me Too Stories movement begins an unstoppable avalanche to smash the patriarchy.
Nina, what was it like for you to read that poem just now?
Well, it's not a hard poem to read because it moves right along from minute to minute. But and it's easy to play the parts of the two Ninas. The other Nina is actually the daughter of a friend of mine. But also that I think this subject has been brewing in me a long time, that for many, many years, I found younger women complaining about this form of sexual abuse, almost comic. I didn't understand what were they complaining about. I mean, this happens all the time. This is everyday stuff. What's the big deal? So that it took me, my consciousness, a long time to develop so that I could look back at my own experience and realize the outrage in it, because I had come to just accept it as that's how life was. So this poem actually took a long time for me to recognize the outrage in it.
My goodness, what an intense revelation. It's surprising to know what it took for you to write the poem. This poem is just so compelling. Neither of the Ninas had ever discussed this aloud, talking about the sexual abuse that can happen in public places when nobody else is looking, perhaps. And then the two Ninas broke their silence. Was it difficult for you to write this poem?
Well, it was relatively easy to write. I wrote it the very night of my birthday party when I should have been exhausted. It was a very large party in a public park, and it was before the pandemic. So there were maybe, I don't know, 50 or 60 people there. So I saw a lot of people, there were a lot of interactions, and I had a lot on my mind, remembering it all. But I knew that I wanted to write this because how extraordinary that conversation had been, and that it was the first time that I was able, it's a way that I caught up with the generations after me, like my daughter's generation, were all outraged way back about sexual abuse. But I had only just caught up. It took me so long. So I wanted to write the poem. I couldn't wait to write the poem. And I did it very easily, and it took very little rewriting.
What a beautiful message, especially in these times. Thank you so much for this, for sharing all of your poems today. Nina Serrano, thank you so much for generously saying yes when I asked if we could have this conversation.
It's been a pleasure. I enjoyed it so much, Valerie. Thank you.